Hutton. He's a respectful journalist in our industry, and we are happy to work with him for quite a long time now. Together with three experts in the field, coming from different disciplines, he will focus on how COVID-19 will speed up sustainable mobility. I hope you will enjoy the webinar. Paul, it's you now.
Thank you very much, Joyce. Welcome to this webinar from Intertraffic, where we discuss how COVID-19 is speeding up the take-up of sustainable mobility. As she says, I'm Paul Hutton. I'll be your moderator for the next 90 minutes, which I want you to be very much part of the discussion, both while we take your views in a series of survey questions and then during the Q&A with our panelists a little bit later on. Please type your questions into the chat section on the website, and we'll come to those once we've spoken to our three guests. Now, the pandemic has certainly challenged cities to quickly adapt their urban mobility systems. There have been and there are major challenges, but there are also huge opportunities to accelerate sustainable urban mobility. So in this challenging time, it's essential that local authorities get support to adapt to the new circumstances. Certainly the consensus is that sustainable mobility is the priority for transport as we recover from COVID-19. So during this Intertraffic webinar, the experts will share their views on how cities can respond to the changing modal shift, how they can adjust their infrastructure and set long-term goals and ambitions for urban mobility. But before we hear from our first guest, I'd like to ask you a couple of survey questions. So first of all, I'd like you just to say which kind of organization you work for. You can see the choices there, and if you can click on your particular area of working, then we can see the answers to that. So I'll give you a few seconds to click on there with the answer on that one. And then when we're ready, we should get the results in a moment or two. So out of the number of people that we have, what do you work for? It's a fairly even mix, really. 14, 23, 15, 7%. So most work in industry, but plenty of people in authorities and consultancy, fewer in research, trade associations or others. Let's have our second question now. Now we know what our audience is this afternoon, and this is your opinion. What is the most vital in contributing to more sustainable urban mobility? I'd like you to just pick one. So is it creating environmental zones and banning traffic from city centres? So that would be restriction. Are we trying to nudge people by encouraging them to use micro-mobility instead of cars? Maybe we could create more pedestrian areas, create more bike lanes and broaden existing bike lanes. So that's providing more infrastructure. Or we could create a long-term vision and clear implementation plans. So that's set visions and goals. So I'd be really interested to know which you think is most vital in contributing to more sustainable urban mobility. Give you a few more seconds to have a think about it, and then we will have a look at the results. Right. A few more people, a little bit reticent on deciding their answers on that one. Very much, though, the consensus is rather than restrictions or nudging or providing infrastructure, 2/5 or a third of people, rather, 40 out of the people involved today have said create a long-term vision and clear implementation plan. So which is quite helpful, really, because part of what we're going to be discussing here today is creating a long-term vision and clear implementation plan. And we'll talk about that first of all with our first guest today. So let me introduce you to John Geykink, who's Senior Lecturer and Research Manager at Breda University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands. Don, welcome to the webinar and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Welcome. Thank you very much, Paul, and welcome everyone in this webinar.
So I'd like to start. I'd like, first of all, your thoughts on what we've just heard from the survey. But what I also want to talk about is how the course of the pandemic has brought momentum to push forward with sustainable mobility, as many people have worked from home. There have been public transport restrictions, meaning in some places micromobility became the only type of mobility for many, and authorities encourage people to consider riding bikes and walking wherever feasible. So all these recent events linked to COVID prompting authorities to accelerate shifts to more sustainable ways of traveling. What have you seen happening all across Europe?
Well, that's a very good question, Paul. And what struck me most is that health has been a major indicator for choosing to be mobile or not. Health has always played a minor role in improving cycling and walking as transport modes because they're healthy. But this is now in a totally different perspective. Health of meaning that you do not get infected. And this is very, very new to our profession. On the short term, I've seen three things happening, best summarized as follows. On the first slide, yes, this works very well. This is a slide from data from the Netherlands, from a Dutch research institute, showing how people on the short term responded to avoiding traveling. We see two lines. The upper line is people that's staying at home. So an increase of an average 50% people staying at home. And at the same time, a decrease, it's the bottom line, of people going to the office. And this more or less reflects, I think, this figure of what we have seen in other parts of Europe and probably other parts of the world as well. So avoiding traveling is one. Second situation, that's the second slide, is a drastic drop in the use of public transport. This is a figure from Move It. And here we see across the globe some similar figures of a drastic drop with up to 80% of public transport ridership. And then gradually recovering, but still staying far more below than it used to be before COVID-19. And this is, I think, a very, very big challenge for all of us. The third thing we have seen happening, and that's the next slide, is a huge increase in cycling lanes, pedestrian areas, micromobility, and so forth. Here you see some snapshots of kilometers of cycling lanes being built. The left picture is from Berlin, but there are a lot of pictures from all over the globe. And it is almost like a revolution, so to say. Cities trying to respond to COVID, putting up cycling lanes as the alternative. Paul, up to you.
We'll come to cycling in a moment, but first of all, ask you, have you got any examples, more examples of some of the decisions taken?
Yes, there are. I did some research. There are loads of examples online. There are various portals, covidmobility.org or Polish Network or Slowcat. They contain numerous portals or examples of initiatives taken. I would like to highlight two initiatives in Europe in the bigger cities. First is Paris, and I can show it on the next slide. The next slide, please. Yes, this is Paris. This is the mayor, Anne Hidalgo. She started a number of years ago with the stimulation of walking and cycling. So way before COVID-19 was even known for. And in the beginning, she was laughed at a little bit, but she has been very successfully implementing cycling and walking infrastructure. And here you see a map, basically following the metro map, the same analogy of the metro in Paris. This is the cycling map. And I think they are very active, and they are speeding up cycling lanes due to this virus. The second example on the next slide, I would like to highlight in Milan. Milan also wants to transform the way we transport ourselves in the city. On the left, you see a picture from a square in Milan as it is now, and a picture of what I assume what it will look like, or maybe it is already implemented. I couldn't find it out. But it is all part of a plan launched called Strade Aperte, which is open roads. Some of my good friends from Milan told me this is a plan from a long time ago that is now relaunched. But honestly speaking, I think it's very good that cities like Paris, cities like Milan are taking a step forward to make sure that low transport modes get priority.
So when we look at certain changes like the reduction in public transport ridership, that is because people are being told to stay at home, and also that social distancing requirements mean people are having to, or that vehicles can have fewer people on them. But as social distancing maybe is relaxed, as we've seen in some parts of the world, for example, in New Zealand, where there's no social distancing rule anymore, that could happen with us. And so therefore we could imagine that public transport ridership will go up again. But do you see therefore that some of these other changes you've been looking at are temporary changes while we cope with the current situation? Or do you think that we're into a situation where actually we could probably end up with these things being permanent?
Yes, I hope, to be honest, that this is a game changer in the way how we approach mobility. Across Europe, we have worked for, well, decades on transforming our cities to become less car dependent. And all of a sudden, this COVID-19 virus gave us a push in that sense, in a direction, especially related to walking and cycling. So yes, I hope it will trigger a more permanent shift, but I'm not fully sure because cities need to respond to this. Now we are all trying to respond spontaneously, as I said, like revolution, putting up cycling lanes. But if things normalize, then we could ask ourselves, do we make this permanent? Or do we continue to make way for individual car use? So there are two main responses: either cities taking this opportunity or this situation to shift towards a more low carbon transport system in the city, or a move towards more car traffic in the city. So it's up to them to make the decisions.
So do you think that we were heading this way anyway, and the shift has happened just quicker because of this? Or do you think that this has been a major change in not necessarily cities' policies, but actually traveling public's acceptance and embracing of the new ways of getting around?
Yes, partly I believe so. There is already a trend of avoiding peak hours, of more walking and cycling across Europe, steep increase of ridership in public transport, and so forth. So yes, multimodality instead of purely car or public transport or cycling modality, it has become more accepted and more normal. However, if you look at office works, it's still not totally accepted across Europe not to appear in the office at 8:30 in the morning if you are a day at work. So you have to travel in peak. And that's something that I hope, thanks to this, well, helped or pushed by this virus, that it's becoming more normal to mix online and offline working, like we all do right now. Instead of having a conference in an event location, we are all logged in on different locations.
What do you think about the future of that then? Because, for example, yes, here we are on an Intertraffic webinar, but I have to admit, I think my enthusiasm for actually showing up at the RAI in Amsterdam and seeing people in 3 dimensions has gone up, not down, in the last 4 months, where we have spent our time looking at screens all day. So how much of a change do you think there might be beyond transport into, as you say, people showing up in the office at 8:30 and going home at 5:30? How much do you see it changing that people work from home to do their work and then go to the office for meetings? or maybe travel at different times in order to try and flatten the peaks that we see morning and afternoon?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've got a nice slide. I think it's the next slide. It shows, this one. You saw at the beginning of the pandemic that everyone tried to make the best of it from home, experimenting with all these online applications. This is the Rotterdam Philharmonic Orchestra performing from home. We're not going to do it right now, but I strongly recommend you to watch this YouTube video because it is really amazing what people were capable of in the time of a lockdown. It's very motivating, but you see more and more, as you say, people want to physically meet again. I also see it in my university. This morning, we had a physical meeting with 8 out of 10 people from the group being physically present and 2 calling in. So I expect this to become more normal and stabilized, that we avoid the peaks. So we have seen an increase in mobility in the Netherlands on the roads. Car traffic is not fully, but it's getting to the levels of pre-corona. But very interestingly, it's not growing in morning peak hours. So we tend to avoid the morning peak. So do our online meetings at home and then travel to the office in whatever modality. I expect this to become more normal. Also to mix online and online activity, and hopefully to continue some of these habits. And there's an interesting series of studies, again from the Netherlands, that I can summarize on the next slide. I took this from a mobility debate in the Netherlands from Vialis, who made a research on various studies performed by Kim, Rai, and Bovach. And you see 3 things. One is respondents continue to partly work from home, or at least use the home base as part of the solution, about 25%. We see a change of modality, the reduction of use of public transport. This is probably going to last for a longer time, is my assumption. And the third one is more cycling. What has not been researched or what has not been reported by this group, but what we also see is the sales of second-hand cars is going to rise. So I'm a bit afraid that in the autumn, when the days get shorter and the weather gets worse, we get off our bikes and start driving our second-hand car to avoid being infected in public transport. But we don't know yet.
Yes, there's certainly some evidence here in the UK that cycling is very dependent on the quality of the weather, but we'll come to how we can cope with that. And for example, how they cope with that in Copenhagen in the deep midwinter, and they're still out on their bikes. We'll come to that in a conversation with the next guest.
Yes.
But it's interesting. I just want to pick up on something you mentioned about we're not really seeing the morning peak anymore. That's interesting from a transport planner's point of view, because really when you think about our road system and our public transport system, it's all designed around coping with that morning and afternoon peak. So how do we keep that let's assume that the pandemic's over, people go back to driving their cars, taking the train or the bus or the tram. How do we keep that curve flat at peak times, and how do we encourage people to continue to use the new modes that they've maybe tried out for the first time, rather than just reverting to the way they used to do it?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a glass ball that we have to look into. I'm afraid. I wish I knew, but if you would ask my advice, what I hope, also based on the over 20 years of European and national research we've been involved in, is that we continue to avoid what we call unnecessary movement of people. And what is unnecessary is not up to me to define, but it's up to us all together to define. But that's by far the most impactful trigger. Not traveling is avoiding many troubles. The second is make permanent what's now temporary. I really hope that all these cities across Europe that have now, with their paint, proactively made way for cycling and walking, I hope they will make it permanent or part of a permanent plan. Because that's the button I clicked when you asked me what's the most successful result. It's definitely having a good long-term plan with actions and resources linked to that. So be brave and make permanent what's now temporary. If we cannot avoid individual car use. An individual car is an excellent mode of transport in many situations. So, but it should not be the only mode of transport. And this has long been normal, that you can drive everywhere with your vehicle in the city. And this is changing. And I hope that city planners take this very serious, that if you cannot avoid individual car use, make sure they get a proper place in the chain of mobility options. And also plan your environments around it. So there is this transit-oriented development, so cities densifying along public transport nodes. In the Netherlands and also Denmark, we see something other interesting, which is bike-oriented development. So it is neighborhoods being developed around cycling infrastructure and cycling lanes to pop up, also to cope with longer distances. I've got two more things. One is to reorganize urban logistics, because now we order everything online instead of driving to the shops. So the number of white vans in the neighborhoods are exploding. I think this is something we should tackle altogether. And finally, continue capacity building and awareness raising, because it's somewhere also between the ears that not driving in peak hour, not driving a car where it's maybe not wise to do, using a bike when the weather is good, or when you don't have to look smart in the office. It can become, this flexible mobility choices can become the new normal. At least this is what I hope.
Okay, with time's running out, just want to ask two more questions, but I'll try and put them into one for you. So first of all, what's the biggest challenge in creating a more sustainable urban mobility system, and how can policymakers and planners engage in sustainable urban mobility, and what tools and guidelines are there that they can use?
Yes, well, to tip upon the previous question, the individual driven car is the elephant in the room in many cities. So we have to understand the power and the limitations of this mode of transport, whether we like it or not. And the more and more I realize that it is a vehicle that's taking up 12 square meters, standing 23 hours a day, fully still, occupying 70% of the public space. So we need to take this serious. Yeah? There are a lot of projects in Europe working on this, projects like Metamorphosis, in which I'm involved, and some other Civitas project to make space for other users of public space, children or family members playing outside or whatever. We see street bingos during COVID in the Netherlands. So the space can be used more than for driving or parking your vehicle. And yes, from Europe, there's a lot of guidance. The European Commission is very active on this with the sustainable urban mobility plans and portals. And very, very recently, a new briefing guide has been presented on how to respond to COVID-19 with transforming your urban mobility plans in the line of public transport, walking, cycling, and micromobility. So we could share the link maybe in the chat to make sure everyone in the audience is able to download this free document.
Okay, we will come back and have more discussions with you once we've heard from our other guests. So you're not free to go yet. We will catch up with you in about 40 minutes time once we've spoken to the other guests. But for now, Don Geikink, thank you very much for sharing your expertise. So that's
welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much, and we'll talk later. So Don will be back for question and answers, and so consequently put your questions into the chat. We'll pick out the best ones, and we will catch up with some more of Don's thoughts a little bit later on. Let's though move on to our next poll question, which is based on what is most vital in creating more bicycle-friendly cities. So what I want you to choose, and they're all good options, but I want you to choose which you think is the best one, is whether it's create dedicated bike lanes, whether it's expand the current cycle infrastructure, it's create more car-free sections of inner cities and use the roads for bikes, or make sure that cycling becomes an integral part of a city's mobility plan. So be interesting to see which you think is the best solution for that one. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to have a think, and then we will get your answer. And then we will talk about that to our next. Now, a lot of you obviously unsure, because we've got nearly 200 people involved, but fewer than 80 decided which one they wanted to vote for. But very much the view is that we should make sure that cycling becomes an integral part of a city's mobility plans, that cycling should become an integral part of a city's mobility plan. So let's now talk more about cycling and find out whether that brings joy to her heart or not, as we talk to Jill Warren, who is co-CEO of the European Cyclists Federation, the ECF. Now, cycling as a resilient and healthy mode of transport has received a lot of attention in the media and politics over the last few months. It looks as though people have recognized the benefits, and also in their everyday mobility behavior during the COVID-19 crisis. For example, in Germany, cycling was the most important mode of transport besides walking at certain points in April, and France has seen cycling levels after lockdown increasing 27% compared to 2019, looking like there has been a shift, and that shift is longer term than just during the necessity of a month or two ago. So as I say, welcome to Jill. Jill Warren, you must be really happy with the trend. How come cities are suddenly accelerating sustainable mobility during this pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, at the European Cyclists Federation, we are absolutely delighted about this, no question about it. Early this year, before there was any talk of a pandemic or the COVID-19 crisis, we said to ourselves, there's never been a better time to promote cycling. Well, we were wrong. A few months later, it's an even better time to be promoting cycling. So that's one very positive effect of something that's otherwise been quite tragic. Yeah, so why is it that cities are suddenly accelerating sustainable mobility? Well, there's a few reasons, and Don alluded to some of these in his talk. So, the need to ease congestion on public transport is one. And also to make sure that people have an alternative to getting back in their cars if that's the bubble they feel safest in, given the conditions that we're facing. And also to make more space for active mobility. So that's, I guess, why this is being promoted. But I think there's another reason, and that's cities seizing opportunities to more quickly implement sustainability measures that were already planned, already being considered, which otherwise would have taken much longer to agree and implement.
And it's quite interesting that we talked there about the people saying cycling becomes an integral part of a city's mobility plan. I've spoken to some transport managers in cities who've told me that they would never have been able to make some of the changes to the roads that they wanted to and planned to as easily without the fact that traffic fell off a cliff, and then they were able to get out onto the roads when they were very quiet and make those changes without having massive traffic jams caused by them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think.
Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, no, I think that the pandemic did accelerate people's mobility choices and those decisions that otherwise were difficult or logistically not there, or the political will not there. So we did see quite a difference and quite a change in what people were willing to implement.
And I noted this down because I wanted to say that, it's not only that those who like to cycle have started to cycle more than they did and feel more confident in cycling, but it seems that those that probably haven't got on a bike since they were a child have started to cycle a lot more as well. Have you seen a real rise not only in the amount of cycling, but the amount of public support and acceptance for cycling?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, during the lockdown, where people were told they could only make essential journeys, but in many places were still encouraged to walk or cycle, to take exercise or to get around. People did. They heeded the call. They did dust off old bikes from the cellar. We did see people who hadn't done it in years doing it. We saw people out teaching their children to bike on empty streets, for the first time ever. This was really, really encouraging to see for us. And more people got a taste of what safe cycling could really be like, because for some people that was, maybe the thing that stopped them from doing it or doing more of it before. And it also showed people that, hey, do we really want to go back to clogged streets after this? All of that's contributed to more public support for cycling generally.
But we've seen the examples Don gave of new cycle paths that are put in by closing off a lane of a road, and other examples he gave. Can you give me a few examples of some of the cycling improvements you've seen in cities and regions in general, and how has the pandemic speeded all this up?
Yeah. So we've been tracking this very, very closely at ECF, particularly in Europe. So some of the things that Don had in his slide of cities that he highlighted, we would notice too on that leaderboard. So Italy, for example, Rome announced 150 kilometers of cycling lanes. Bologna, 94 kilometers. Torino, 80 kilometers of traffic calming or traffic reduction measures to encourage more cycling. In Spain, two of the cities that stand out are Granada and Barcelona, with 60 and 20 kilometers of cycle lanes respectively, and also some traffic calming and reduction measures. Elsewhere in Europe, Lisbon has done quite a lot. Paris, we heard, has for a long time been doing quite a lot, and even more during the pandemic. And Brussels, a place where I've lived at various points in time in the past 30 years, which has never been famous for being a great city for cycling, announced 40 kilometers of cycle paths, and they're being implemented, as we speak, every day something new. And quite a lot of traffic calming and reduction measures as well, including in the Pentagon-shaped inner ring of Brussels, traffic reduction to 20 kilometers an hour. So changes I never would have expected to see even just 6 months ago.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing it. I was in Brussels, I think, in early March before all this really took hold. And come to think of it, it didn't really occur to me. But yes, there wasn't a huge amount of cycling that you would see in comparison to Amsterdam. So it'll be interesting to see how things have changed when I can get over again. Now, one of the things I wanted to say was about the amount of data that we've got. I mentioned that I'm involved in a weekly report that we produce here in the UK of travel on different modes, and that's how I was able to mention the clear correlation here between weather and the amount of cycling, and we'll come on to that in a moment. But I understand you've got a leaderboard where you're kind of looking at how much sustainable mobility there is taking place in different cities. Tell me some more about that.
Yeah, I mentioned that we've been tracking COVID-related cycling improvements quite closely throughout Europe. So if we go to the first slide, I can kind of show you what we've been doing. We set up a dashboard that's available at ecf.com/dashboard. So if you go to the next slide, the opening page of that shows us kind of some key numbers, headline figures total kilometers of measures announced, which is here about 2,000. Total kilometers of measures actually implemented, because we fact check everything. It's not enough just to announce it. We see has it actually been implemented, and then the budget spent on these measures. So here 900,000. So this is updated on a continuous basis since we launched it. So I encourage you to look back and kind of see the progress going on. If we go to the next slide, we can see here kind of an overview. The countries map here is interactive. If you click on a country, it will show you what measures are being done in that particular country. We've also given star ratings to the countries. So France, you see here, is green. That means they have a very high star rating for things that have been done there. So we gave up to 5 stars. So a star if any measures at all are announced. A star if at least 1 kilometer per 1 million inhabitants of any infrastructural measures are already implemented in that country. A star if at least €1 per person allocated to fiscal or other measures, and a star if the capital city, has at least 3 stars in the city star rankings. So just different ways to kind of, I guess, evaluate and measure and rate what's going on. We've actually had quite a bit of interest in this tracker and people asking if they could use the data for other things, which we're delighted about, because we're very happy to have this out there and available to people, but also for people to submit, say, hey, you're missing this, or you haven't got that, and we update that continuously. Next slide, please. This one here kind of shows the cities. The size of the bubble is proportionate to the number of measures that are being taken there. Just to tell you exactly what measures we track. So we track infrastructure measures, so kilometers of cycle lanes that are created, so announced and implemented, traffic calming and reduction measures that would enable more cycling, car-free areas, wider sidewalks, things like that. We also track fiscal measures or subsidies, so vouchers or other subsidies for the purchase or repair of bikes, such as was done in France, these €50 vouchers that you could use to have your bike repaired, or in Italy, vouchers for purchase of bikes, things like that. Cycle to work incentives would fall under that as well. And we also track other evidence of additional budget that's been allocated to promote cycling. That might include things like money for campaigns to promote cycling. Next slide, please. Yeah, then we've got 2 leaderboards, one tracking the cities and, by the total measures, and then those are split into the various types of measures. Those are the colors in those bar graphs. And then next slide. We also track by population. That's to make sure that the very biggest cities don't get all the attention, or countries. We also want to track, kind of the investments per capita of population, so that we also, can kind of see that proportion in the data. So that's pretty much the slides that I wanted to show. In terms of what we do with the collected data, we use it first and foremost in our advocacy work and in our member organizations' advocacy work. So we are the umbrella organization for national cycling federations throughout Europe. So our participants from the Netherlands will be familiar with Fietsersbond. That's one of our members, etc. And we share this data with them and also collect it from them. We share it with journalists, academics, with the cycling industry. And, we track this, in terms of how could you make some of these measures permanent? Well, what have we got there? How's it working? How can we advocate for a more permanent solution here or there?
Okay, so that's very good from your point of view and what you do with the data. If I'm a transport manager, or I work in a city in some way, how can I use the data, other than looking at it and going, oh, that's quite interesting? What actual sort of tangible benefits can I get from seeing the data you've collected?
Yeah, I think you can see what peer cities are doing. or not doing. I think that can be very powerful. You can see what's going on elsewhere. That might be part of the argumentation you need to convince your own stakeholders to invest in these kinds of measures, for example. I think, once you see what's going on somewhere else, you can then take the further steps to find out, well, how did you do that? What was the best practice? How did you convince whoever you needed to convince? How much did it cost? How might I do something different? So I think there's definitely a sharing and a best practice element there as well. And I guess to be a bit more specific, one thing we've also done at ECF that's very closely related to this is to put out a set of 5 recommendations that we hoped would inspire municipalities, cities, countries, regions, etc. So the road to COVID recovery, we called it. We said that roads should be repurposed for cycling. We advocate for lower traffic speed in cities, also to enable safer cycling, especially in those places where it's not separated cycling infrastructure, but sharing the roads with cars. We advocated for a 5 billion EU e-bike access fund, because we think e-bikes are really the measure that has the potential to replace car traffic in cities. And so we think investing in that at EU level really sends that strong signal and helps the uptake of that. Cycle logistics, we're recommending that cities try to implement measures that would make more of the delivery traffic be done by cycle. Our studies show that over 50% of motor vehicle trips for moving goods inside of cities could be switched to bikes. And given that about 90% of commercial vans and trucks are diesel fueled, and one cargo bike can, replace about or eliminate 5 tons of CO2 emissions a year, it's really worth, trying to push this solution as well. Last but not least, and something that maybe hasn't factored into the discussion so far, but we see a lot more potential for cycling tourism, with people wanting to stay closer to home this year, having healthy vacations that are kind of active and outdoors, and maybe not in big cities, with tons of other people. That's a real viable alternative that we think there should be more investment in this year and beyond.
Okay, can I just rewind? I want a bit more detail on the deliveries you talked about, because of course, when I've got to do my tax return for my business soon enough, and I've realized that I don't have any receipts, physical receipts, because I haven't bought anything out. I haven't traveled anywhere. Everything has been done online, all my deliveries online. So I might get 3 or 4 different deliveries a day. And Don mentioned earlier that we need to get round that by having a far more sensible and coordinated mechanism to deliver goods to people. But how does the cycling delivery solution work, and how have the big delivery companies embraced that idea?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it can't just be one player that wants to do it. I think the cities have to want to do it and make sure that the infrastructure is there, or the hubs are there that make that possible. I think also the delivery companies need to want to do it, and so it's a partnership there, really, to make that possible. Brussels, for example, in the last days has just announced that they've become recipients of a 5 million grant to push for cargo bike logistics in the city, as one very good example. And if you read the details of that, you see it's not just Brussels deciding to do this. It's a whole bunch of partners working together to make that happen.
And what are the long-term, in your view, what's the long term now for cycling? You said there was never a better time, then you got a better time.
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to hold on to the positives from all the negatives that we've had over the last 4 months, and actually then make sure that this is a long-term modal change?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is the biggest challenge for organizations like ECF. We think advocacy has a really strong role to play in all of this. It's making sure people know why this is a good idea, what's the evidence behind it, and you push, you get the activists with you, you get the policymakers on board, you speak to the decision makers, you bring them the right argumentation. Everybody knows it's the right thing to do, but how can you back it up with statistics, with evidence, with all sorts of things that make that the palatable and decision that they're willing to take. So it's moving that into political will. And for us, that means taking the opportunities now and showing, hey, this is a really great idea because look what it's brought. Look at the reductions in emissions that this has brought, and all of the benefits, and using the messages in the best way you can to advocate for the permanent solutions and the more cycling and the investments needed to make that happen.
Okay, so I'm a guy who probably has been on his bike far more in the last 4 months than I have in the last 4 years. So I'm exactly one of the people you've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, here in rainy old England, we've had far better weather. We've had, basically the whole of April, May and June was glorious. And so it was nice to get out on the bikes. And I mentioned that the statistics we're gathering show that when it rains, the cycling levels fall dramatically. And I'm thinking, yeah, it's all very well at the moment, but when it's freezing cold in the middle of January, or if I lived in Madrid and it was 40 degrees, I can't imagine I'd want to cycle. I want to be in my heated or air-conditioned car or some other way of getting around. So how does it work? I've been to Copenhagen. I've rented an e-bike in Copenhagen and had a great time cycling around, but that was in October when it wasn't too hot, wasn't too cold. When we get such variations of weather in different parts of the continent, how do we encourage people all year round to get on two wheels?
Well, you have a saying my Danish colleague tells me there's this saying in Danish. I believe it's the same expression in Dutch and a couple of other languages, that there is no bad weather, there's only bad clothing. um, I do think that, if you make cycling so convenient that it is the most convenient and fastest way to get somewhere, that will get some people past the hurdle of, okay, maybe the weather's not so great, but I'm going to do it anyway. I think you need to disincentivize car travel as well, because if it's too easy to step into that alternative and take your car to work or shopping or wherever you're going to take it, then you make it much easier for people to oh, well, it's raining, it's bad weather today. Okay. So I think that's part of it as well. But getting back to the clothing part, yeah, those who haven't invested in the right clothing for that too. It's been said by some cycling advocates that going to an outdoor shop and getting really proper, sort of rain gear or breathable, great stuff that you can still get to your destination, relatively dry, etc., will cost you maximum 3 tanks of gas. So I would encourage people to think of that in terms of an investment that could be made in the weather question.
Jill from the ECF, don't go away because we're going to have, I've got loads of questions. I just haven't had the time to ask you, but, and I've seen questions coming in on the chat as well. So we'll pick out some of those in a few minutes time. We'll move on to our next part of the survey and then our final guest, and then we'll come back from some more questions and answers from you in a moment. But for now, Jill Warren from the ECF, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so now it's time for you to get thinking again as we move to our next survey question. So let's call up the question that we have, the fourth of our questions this afternoon, which is your experience in shared micro-mobility. So, have you found shared micro-mobility to be a pleasant addition for everyday first and last mile travel? That you've maybe only used them occasionally, that you've never used micromobility at all, so can't comment, or have you had bad experiences and actually you've therefore stopped using them? We're just really interested to know the answer. So have a think about that one and click your answers. And in a moment, we will see what the continent feels when it comes to micromobility. Here we go. Again, lots of people thinking, not sure. We've got nigh on 200 people now, 70 of them. And look at that, never use them. And in fact, we've had a few people say they've had a bad experience. 13 out of the 79 people have said that they find it a pleasant addition, but then others maybe just a novelty, using them occasionally, or they never use them. So that's interesting stuff. And I think it'll be interesting to hear what our third guest has to say about this. So let's meet him and go about 100 kilometers west of where I am into London and speak to Giles Bailey, Head of Policy and Partnerships at vianova.io. So Giles, thank you very much for being on the panel today. First and last mile mobility solutions such as offered by micromobility, they're increasingly discussed for developed cities across Europe to enhance the robustness and multimodality of the transport system. And they've seen a rise in new mobility services like bike sharing, e-bikes, e-scooters. They brought opportunities and challenges, especially in the use of public space. As we've seen there, not necessarily a huge take up as yet, but what are the opportunities for cities when it comes to micromobility? Just waiting now for Giles to put his camera on and join us. At least I'm hoping Giles is still here. Right, you see, this is always what happens. It's all going swimmingly, it's all going seamlessly, and then this happens. So I'm just checking to see whether or not, while we wait for Giles to appear, whether or not Don and could maybe come back and join us for a moment. We could speak to Don and Jill, see if they would like to rejoin us here. So Don is coming back, and Jill, and hopefully we'll get to hear from Giles Bailey in a moment, and he'll come back and join us. But Don, thank you for coming back so quickly. So we talked all cycling there with Jill. What were your thoughts from what Jill was saying?
Yes, I think it's very good that the Dutch Fietsersbond has a European brother or sister, family member, with the European Cycling Federation. I think the Dutch and the Danish are an exception to the average European. And I think that's what the ECF is now striving for, to make sure that the cities that are still lacking behind, let's say, our countries are catching up. And luckily, we have the Dutch and we have the Danish cycling embassies, which is a cooperation among various stakeholders to work together on the international capacity building on cycling. We do it worldwide, and our university is also a member of the Dutch Cycling Embassy, but we hold close relationships also to the Danish ones. So in that sense, I believe we can be very, very good examples for the rest of Europe to boost cycling. But it starts with making proper infrastructure. You cannot boost cycling if there's no way to cycle safely. So that's certainly step one, and that's what cities are catching up now.
That's what I was going to ask, actually, which is the fact that is it a virtuous circle? You make it attractive to cycle, and therefore more people decide to cycle, therefore you have justification for investing more in it, and it goes around like that. And do we find that in some other cities, people who wish to cycle are actually put off because they, even if they want to, and there are plenty of people that want to, they actually, without the infrastructure there first, choose to take another mode because it's just they don't feel safe?
Well, yeah, to respond to that, because as a Dutchman, we have been challenged this question all over the world. Yeah, why do you cycle so much? Of course, because you have a flat country. I say, okay, but we have also Danish weather and Danish
Yes, you have
clothing.
wind.
And we have wind. So yes, we have all kind of reasons why not to cycle or why we do cycle. But one of the ingredients is, and it started after the Second World War, mid 50s, starting to build cycling infrastructure. And I think personally, I believe any city, well, basically any city in Europe and in the world could follow this example. Either it's not being too steep, too hilly, climatologically not too challenging. I mean, to talk about the weather, 6% of the time in the Netherlands it rains. So either you're very unlucky, or you can time your trip when it's not raining, using all kind of apps that you can use these days. So it's a culture.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
yeah, Jill, do you want to pick up and give some more thoughts, and then I've got a question for you in a moment.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would love to talk about in that sense is, how that culture, that cycling culture, is slowly moving. And one place we've been seeing that, or looking for it, if you like, is less in those countries like Denmark and the Netherlands that already have very good infrastructure and years-long experience with all the policies and things to make that happen. One place we've been looking for that from our kind of pan-European point of view is in the EU member states' national energy and climate plans, so the NECPs, which each country is required to produce and discuss with the European Commission. So we compared the draft versions of those that were due at the end of 2018 with the final versions that were produced about 1 year later after consultations with the Commission. And we saw that, we were looking at the plans in terms of, did they have explicit targets to grow cycling? Did they have budgets and investments earmarked for that? Did they have sustainable and active mobility plans that included cycling? Did they want to improve the safety for cyclists and other vulnerable road users? Fiscal incentives, you name it. And, we scored these things. And the two countries that came out on top by far were France and Austria in these plans. Belgium, Cyprus, Italy, Portugal, and Luxembourg also scored quite well. In the middle, you had countries like Denmark and the Netherlands that already have very good infrastructure and don't have, all the catching up to do. And then you had quite a few countries where there's room for improvement. So, looking at all of that also gives you a clue as to how that, where the awareness levels are, how that culture is changing, and maybe how much further some places have to go.
Okay, so you've found out what they are and aren't doing.
Mm-hmm.
What about the ones that aren't doing very much? Have you asked them why?
Well, we certainly have spoken, with our members in those particular countries to say, wow, this is where we would advise you to focus your advocacy work in the next months. So it really gives us something pretty concrete to go on in terms of where they might be able to get access to EU funding, to do what it is that they want to achieve.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you. We'll come back for some more questions from the two of you, because I want to talk a bit more about pedestrians as well as cyclists in a moment. But Giles, by the wonders of modern technology, has joined us. Yes. And is not in any way stressed about the fact that his connection died and he's had to restart using a different laptop to get online. Giles, deep breath. We didn't even notice you weren't there. Everything is fine. So just to remind you, I mentioned a little bit about Giles and the fact he's head of policy and partnerships at Via Nova. And that we were talking about micromobility increasingly being discussed for the for cities to enhance robustness and multimodality of the transport system. Now, Giles, we had a little survey that we asked what people's experience was about micromobility, and actually the majority had never used it. So a few, of people watching said, yep, use it, really good for first and last mile. A few had, like literally a handful, had tried it almost, it seems, as a novelty. And a few, very small number, had said they tried it, hated it, didn't want to use it again. But most haven't even tried it. So is that your experience of micromobility, that it's kind of something people are vaguely aware of, but it's done by other people?
Well, again, thank you very much, Paul, for having me this afternoon. And yeah, apologies for the technology, but always a bit of a challenge, but we got there in the end. I think to get to your question, yes, a lot of people would have seen particularly e-scooters on streets around cities all over Europe and the rest of the world, although they're still relatively new in the UK where I am. But I think the broader question is, as Jill and Dawn have said, mobility is changing. For COVID and for lots of reasons in society, we have a lot of challenges we need to deal with. And one of those challenges is creating new opportunities and new options for people to get around, particularly in local journeys. And owning a bike is one solution. Making the public transport network work and work effectively in a post-COVID world is another solution. But we need to broaden and depthen the range of opportunities. And one of those opportunities is particularly shared micromobility scooters, shared bikes, and lots of devices like that. And I think people already have seen a lot of that, and they will see more and more, because it is actually one of the solutions for a broad-based sustainable transport system in cities around the world. And again, an important point, it's not micromobility or public transport. They're not fighting it out for who is going to, quote, win. They absolutely should work together and need to work together for a successful city. And to deal with some of the narrative about too many cars, a drift back to using cars exclusively, which will clearly make our cities not work. And this is where Via Nova is working as an organization and company.
And so, for example, you mentioned here in the UK, legislation was rushed through to widen the scope of trials of e-scooters. How has the pandemic influenced the use of micromobility?
So again, as particularly Jill was saying, in the rise of cycling, and again, it's important to look at micromobility as a range of devices we've seen today, and new devices, new formats that will come forward. But it very much includes cycling, includes e-scooters, includes shared as well as personally owned. And it's also important to look at e-bikes, e-mopeds, other kinds of devices will go into this pool of shared micromobility. And again, when we go to this idea of localized travel, this idea that people are making shorter distances and they want to make them on spaces that again have been freed up by the lack of traffic and suppression of car traffic, micromobility very much is one of those solutions you need to have in place. And you will already see a lot of it, and where I live in London and cities around Europe, but more and more as time goes by.
How are you helping cities actually understand how they can make micromobility part of their overall transport infrastructure, Giles?
And at that point, if you could go to the first slide, I just have to just give you a bit more of a context of what we're trying to do. So again, a fair amount of things on this slide, but just very, very briefly, on the left-hand side, you can see there are mobility services. So whether shared scooters, shared mopeds, ride-hailing, other types of devices present in a city. And again, across a range of different operators, all working collaboratively, collectively to deliver these kinds of services. And on the right-hand side, you see city assets. And the assets of a city are its streets, its curb space, loading bays, a range of different things the city offers to make mobility work. What we do is we offer a control panel for the city to look at regulation, enforcement, planning, long-term thinking about all of these mobility services based on the assets that the city has. And again, that kind of virtuous circle of what assets do you have? How are they being used? Are they being used in a way that follows local city regulations? Are the operators doing what they should be doing? But also in a longer term way, is that actually helping drive forward the sustainable mobility plans of your city? the long-term mobility goals. And you can see we, in the very center, offer that control panel that looks across operators, providing ongoing databases, statistics, heat maps of activity. And if you go to the second slide, which just provides that kind of dashboard in a little bit more detail, again, across a range of operators, and you can see what's happening today by hour, what perhaps infringements are, where you might need to deploy resources to make sure the shared micromobility services are operating efficiently and effectively, what kind of local active policies you've put in place, whether mobility hubs where you're gathering together devices on street to make sure they're occurring and operating efficiently. And again, there are many different dashboards and interfaces we offer across the management of the service. This is yet one example, but again, it gives you that feel from the city's point of view. How will you know your shared micromobility is operating efficiently, effectively? The operators are doing as they should, and as you've asked them to do, in a real-time basis. And also more fundamentally, how is your shared micromobility interacting with your public transport and your broader road network? All of that insight, all of that data is critical to make sure the overall public transport, the overall transport system in the city is operating efficiently, effectively, and as it should. Those are the two slides if you want to go back to the main chat.
So you mentioned fitting other transports or fitting in with other transport modes. So that sounds very much like mobility as a service. So how does this all fit into the mobility as a service providers, or vice versa? How do mobility as a service providers embrace micromobility?
Okay, so to start with that, I'd say on that point, Via Nova is not a mobility as a service operator. We're not selling tickets and repurposing data. And in some ways, to answer your question, ultimately, so Via Nova, we're working with cities, governments to make sure mobility works. But it does come back to the data question. Ultimately, for mass mobility as a service to work, you need rich, broad data across all of the operations of mobility in your city, so that other mass operators can pull the data together and create insight, sell tickets, create route planning, and so on. And as a city, how will you get that rich, comprehensive, robust data for shared micromobility? It's through the kinds of services that we offer as Via Nova, collecting the data and making sure across operators it's robust, it's accurate, it's consistent. And from the city's point of view, that it's actually in one place as opposed to across all of the various micromobility operators you may have in your city. So we're really enabling mass for the wider city ecosystem, but again, we're not a mass operator.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, here in the UK, trials have been speeded up very quickly, and this is happening all the way across the continent. And of course, when you start implementing something new, you are prone to make mistakes because that's how you get it right. Now, given that you've been doing this for a long time, I think I saw a presentation 3 or 4 years ago in London by you, Giles. What can you recommend? What advice can you give to a city that's thinking, right, we need to implement, we need to try this out? How can they avoid making some what may not seem obvious mistakes?
Okay, clearly there is a lot to learn, and let's not pretend that micromobility isn't a cookie cutter. You just press the button, we're done, we just move on to the next thing. And again, the world of mobility has changed quite significantly, perhaps for the better, in the post-COVID world. I'll say a range of different things. As an organization, Via Nova has just published a policy set of guidelines, which if you I'll put on the chat, or you can contact us or see them on LinkedIn. But I think the key thing for the cities really is the data arrangement you have with the operators, so that you have a clear understanding of the data that they will provide, that they do provide it, how it will be collected and how it will be used, and that is managed on an ongoing basis through clear KPIs and understandings. And again, that isn't a negative thing necessarily for the operators. It gives them a very clear template for the context in which they'll operate in the city, what they're expected to do, and that they will be monitored, that they do that in terms of the agreement they have with the city. And that plays out across the operators you have within your city. I think it's also important for the cities to consider that, as I said, showed in my earlier diagram, there are a range of different kinds of shared micromobility. And we might get a bit fixated on e-scooters, but there will be others. And so it's to be expected you're going to have a range of different operators. So a multi-stakeholder environment of operators to work with. And you need to think about how you'll manage your context, your data, your city across that range of different operators. So think about that idea of a mixed market model. And from a city's point of view, don't just kind of consider everyone else is doing shared micromobility, I should do it as well. Let me get something on street and go on to the next thing. Think of it very much in terms of addressing the mobility plans, the mobility expectations of your residents, your policy plans, your policy objectives for the city in terms of localized transport in various communities, the tourist trade. You might have excluded communities in your city who have limited transport options. And this could be a way of, again, of increasing the range of opportunities they have. You know, it might often seem that you see many of these shared services in the heart of the city, in the central business area, the tourist area. But there are many other user cases in cities where shared micromobility can add real, substantive, useful benefits to residents. And all of that should be in the planning context for what the city needs to do, how it operates and how it engages with operators, how it collects the data, and how it manages the overall service, which I would say the VNover platform is there to help the cities do that.
Now, people have got private e-scooters, they've got their own. I've been walking down the platform at Liverpool Street Station in London on more than one occasion and had my ankle clattered by somebody on one. You walk around London or in other cities, but London particularly has its share of cyclists who think red lights are for other people and just ignore the rules of the road, so you can almost get into collisions with them. So when you offer something new to human beings, unfortunately some of them don't play by the rules. So where does enforcement and regulation fit into all of this, and how do we avoid, if we're using rented e-scooters for a 20-minute journey, for example, just having piles of scooters cluttering up the pavement?
So many comments and issues in that question, Paul. So I'll try and unpick a few as we go through. I mean, to start with, e-scooters are new, particularly in the UK. And again, there is a natural focus on the newness of them. Like anything new, we have to understand how they're used, the rules, the regulations, publish them in a legalistic way, in a government way, but actually get that out to users. And yes, I'm seeing more e-scooters on the streets today, but living in London for 25 years, I can remember, and I still see, irresponsible cyclist use, and I'm a cyclist as well. And that is bad, and it requires enforcement and training and a process to ensure cycling is done well. We could apply it to taxi drivers and lorries and everybody else as well. Yeah. In crowded cities and congested cities, transport needs to follow by the rules. And to have clear, enforceable, understandable rules for existing modes, but actually new modes as well. And that's kind of the thinking and debate I think we need to be thinking about shared micromobility. What are the rules? Are they enforceable? Are they logical? Can users really follow them? But also I'll say, can you ensure, and are you ensuring in real time that across the operators, if you're having, again, shared services, that you're ensuring as a city that those operators are also following the rules? Again, you might hear anecdotal stories or someone said this on Twitter or whatever, but in real time, can you check? Can you get an officer out there to see what is going on street? Do you have the data to have a data-led conversation with the operators, and again, to ensure that they're actually following the rules you want to follow in your city? That kind of thinking process, I think, will get us e-scooters into a useful, productive part of shared micromobility, but again, to broaden and depthen the overall range of mobility in a city.
You touched on some of the data that you had there. I want to just pick up a bit more on some of the pilots you're running. So you've got pilots running in Brussels, in Faro, and in Marseille. What are some of the data insights? What have you learned from those pilots?
Again, so we're running as you know, we're running our software in a range of European cities. So Brussels, we've run in Marseille, Faro, Zurich. We've signed a recent deal with Helsinki and another pending deal in Scandinavia as well. And obviously, we're very, very keen on the British market as e-scooters are legalized in this country. Many things we could talk about, but again, I'll follow the same narrative, and particularly perhaps alluding to what's actually going on in Brussels, where again, as Jill was saying, Brussels was a bit overly car friendly for a number of years, certainly the visits I went there. But recently, Brussels has changed quite a bit, and they were very keen to have micromobility, shared scooters. They were on the streets, but they had a need about control. And how do you make them, again, a productive part of the mobility ecosystem? And one of the things in particular in Brussels was the idea of mobility hubs. How can they corral or gather together the range of shared mobility in designated areas to create street space for pedestrians and everybody else, but so that the micromobility though is managed in a way that's productive and useful for citizens. And whether at the major rail stations or tram kind of hub stations, how would those mobility hubs be designed, located, but again, also enforced? Again, it's interesting to have anecdotal stories of there was a scooter not in or a scooter broken or this one should have been worked better. But as we have with public transport and road transport and every other bit of the transport system, we need comprehensive, clear, in-depth data on an ongoing basis of as the system is managed. And that is a way we get all bits of the transport system, including shared micromobility, to be a serious, grown-up, integrated part of the overall system. And that challenge was, again, something that we helped Brussels Mobility through when they're thinking about shared micromobility. And e-scooters and shared micromobility are still very much part of the Brussels ecosystem. And I think they're operating in a much more productive way than perhaps they were operating a year and a half ago.
Okay, Giles, we're almost out of time. I just want to ask one last question, which I touched on the UK government's fast tracking of the national e-scooter trial. How heartened have you been by that? And do you have any examples across Europe of this sort of initiative or some advice for people about how they might implement this sort of initiative?
Well, again, I'm very heartened that the UK government has decided to enable e-scooters and shared micromobility in this country. Lots to learn, and every ecosystem, every country is different for cultural, practical, weather reasons. Again, I would argue for cities, don't think that this is a one-off and we're done. There will be challenges and issues as we go forward. Be data-led, be KPI-led, and be very much integrated in terms of what you want to see come out of mobility generally, rather than, again, see this as a one-off. In terms of good examples in other cities, again, across many of the French cities, from Paris to Brussels, Switzerland, Zurich, and again, I've seen a lot of very interesting experience coming out of all of the Scandinavian countries, again, who have perhaps more of a cycling culture, but have also seen shared micromobility deployed and being deployed in a way that's actually, again, productive part of the overall transport system.
Okay, thank you very much, Giles. Let's bring in Don and Jill as well to have some questions from our audience today. But while we're bringing them in, I'm going to ask each of you very quickly to tell me what's your biggest takeaway from the COVID-19 crisis. And Giles, you can start because you're first here. So as I say, what's your biggest takeaway?
Again, very briefly, because I've been talking for a while. Transport can change radically on a level that we would never have expected only a few months ago. And again, I think that's incredibly positive, but as an industry, it's incredibly challenging in terms of the rapid rate of change we can see. And again, how we defend that change in a sustainable way.
Jill?
I think my biggest takeaway is the evidence and the arguments have always been on our side, but now it's even more so, and more of the public is with us. So we need to harness that to further increase good policy making and investments in cycling.
Dom?
Yeah, my biggest takeaway from all of this is our vulnerability. I mean, only in the Netherlands, we face a 60 billion euro deficit because of one little virus blocking our whole situation. So, and the mobility is part of that. So somehow we talk a lot about smart mobility and smart living, but somehow we are not, maybe we think we are smart, but we're not as resilient as we would like to be. That's my biggest lesson for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's I've got one last question I've written down to ask you at the end, but just want to go to some of the questions that we've been picking out from the live chat that's been going on while we've been talking. The increase in urban cycling lanes has, especially with the reduction in the number of people on public transport, has this had or caused any urban mobility or logistic problems? And any of you feel free to chip in here.
Shall I start and then you add, Giles and Jill?
Yeah.
What we have seen numerous studies in the Netherlands and other countries in Europe is that public transport and cycling, they are each other's cannibals. So if you invest in public transport, people start using bicycles less. And if you invest in cycling, they use public transport less. One of the reasons why in the Netherlands, on average, active modes, cycling and walking, is percentage-wise much higher than public transport. So that's certainly what I also see happening now with public transport being under pressure. I expect people to continue to use two-wheelers, bikes, power two-wheelers more than before. The question for urban logistics, I quickly looked at the question. Would be interesting to explore further cycling logistics. For example, I ordered something online a couple of weeks ago and the shop came delivering it by bike, which I liked a lot. Or I would pick it up myself somewhere with a bike or any other combination. That's still, I think, a field of research that we need to explore together. But I leave up to Giles and Jill to add
Jill?
to me.
Yeah, I would say cycling logistics in particular, we still have a long way to go, generally, policy-wise and otherwise. I think the question was in particular, has this led to problems or things to be solved?
Has this caused any urban mobility or logistics problems? Because if you're taking huge swathes of the road space out to allocate to bikes, what's happened with that?
Yeah, a couple of things. So where some streets have been turned into pedestrian streets or slow streets or other things, you've moved congestion to other places as more cars have come back on the roads, and that's caused a bit of problem here and there that we know of. In terms of lots more cyclists, where you already had quite a few cyclists, I'm aware in some places that they've made some adjustments, like changing the traffic lights and everything so that that can flow better and that people won't clog up at the intersections and then destroy the benefits that you've got from the social distancing that you're trying to achieve through that. So there's a bit of that as well. These are things that we're anecdotally hearing here at ECF.
What about road safety? Because I mentioned that, for example, cycling around Copenhagen, took to it like a duck to water, loved it. Whereas, although I've only lived in London for 6 months, I've spent most of my life living certainly within an hour's commute of London. When I'm in London, I tend to walk. I don't much like the underground with other people's armpits in my face while I'm traveling. So I do like to walk around the city centre, but I wouldn't feel comfortable cycling. So how do we sort the road safety side of things to encourage people to be more of a pedestrian or a cyclist and less rely on motorized transport?
If I could just jump in briefly on this in the previous question as well. I think there's an issue of the infrastructure. And that goes back into the whole perception, I think, of micromobility and shared micromobility as well. And it's a difficult one for local authorities because it's a constant need to improve and join together across wider areas. Cycle lanes, segregated cycle lanes that have sufficient capacity. And although we've had them for many years, again, for example, in London, one of the outcomes of the last 4 months is that in quite a few places they are under capacity as more and more people take to cycling, but also, as we will see, to shared micromobility, to e-scooters and other devices as well. And that constant issue of improving the quality of the network, ironically, as we've done for public transport for many years, needs to be done for micromobility as well.
Yeah, what you see is that I saw in the chat, briefly scrolling up, that some countries and cities are struggling with finding enough money to invest in cycling infrastructure. From one point of view, I can understand, but it also tells me that cycling as a mode of transport does not receive the priority it should get, because 1 kilometer of cycling lane is by far cheaper than a kilometer of road. And we are still used to having roads because we believe they are good for the economy. And there's more and more evidence that we can decouple car accessibility with economic growth. I mean, if you look at any country, any city in the Netherlands, you have extremely high shares of cycling and still a relatively high economy. So it is possible to do it. It just needs political courage to actually do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I see it. I'm biased from the Netherlands, I know, but that's the story I used to tell to people in London, that I also wouldn't cycle in London because I wouldn't feel safe. But there's so many roads. Why not give them up a little bit to give a safe space for bikes or e-scooters or whatever to use them for?
Okay, and Giles, just one last question that's come in on the chat, and then I want to just wrap up because we are very nearly out of time. How would you advise new players in micromobility to be part of a transport system and benefit from all that we've seen over the last 4 months?
You, as an entrepreneur in, call it new mobility, you bring great ideas and great practices, and cities need them, but you need to speak to the city. And again, I'm not pretending that's always easy, or finding the right person or finding the right attitude in the city, but that engagement is a core part of ultimately what you're trying to do, and to work in the context of everything else. So conversation, positive engagement, being parts of events like this, and to understand the ecosystem in which you're working, and seeing how in a long-going way you can bring overall sustainability improvements to the choices of transport in the city.
Okay, Don, Jill, and Giles, one last question. I want you to take literally 30 seconds each, which is, what are your challenges and opportunities to sum up to boost sustainable mobility in the next few months?
Very good question. 30 seconds is very short. I hope after a long deserved summer break, we will continue our good habit even when the days get shorter and the rain starts falling.
Jill?
Yep. I think the biggest challenges are always to get the right authorities to make the public investments that need to be made to have that safe and quality cycling infrastructure that will, have that lasting effect of having more people cycling more often.
And I'd say, again, it was the kind of point I've just made, speaking to the empowered, engaged right person in the local authorities who have the role across mobility to bring the kind of innovation we'd like to drive forward. Getting around to the electronic table of that person is the thing we're trying to do.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Don. Thank you, Jill. And thank you, Giles, for a fascinating 90 minutes discussion. And I think a very positive one about how sustainable mobility really can make a difference to our cities as we come out of the crisis that we've been in. Thank you for watching. I'm sorry I haven't been able to get to half of the questions that you've been putting in the chat, but we'll try and get to them. But as I say, we had so much to talk about, but I hope you've learnt a lot from this as well. Remember that Intertraffic is really leading the thoughts on a range of transport solutions over the months until we all meet in the Rye in Amsterdam next March. So we'll have another webinar next month. I'm producing a series of podcasts as well, so have a listen to those. We've got a podcast at the moment online that's all about data. But for now, thank you very much indeed for taking part, and we'll speak to you again soon. All the very best. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
For moderating.
All right.
Yes, goodbye, everyone.